Hi guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I'd like to talk today about foods and how they can affect your mood. In particular, I'd like to talk about foods that can make you tired and sleepy, and I'd like to talk about foods that keep you awake and alert. Now, this is a very complex subject, and it delves into biochemistry and neurophysiology, so I'll try and keep this as simple as possible for everybody to understand. However, the best place to start in this topic is with carbohydrates, because anecdotally most people are aware that carbohydrate foods make them tired. Bread, wheat, cereal, these kinds of foods tend to make people sleepy, and they're actually good foods to eat before you go to bed in small amounts for this reason. Now, what we need to understand first is, why do carbohydrates make you tired? What is it about carbohydrate foods that can induce sleep? And what can we do to counter that if we don't want to be in a sleepy state throughout the day? The reason that carbohydrate foods make us tired is because they increase or can increase the plasma levels, the blood levels of an amino acid called L-tryptophan. Now, L-tryptophan is able to be transported into the central nervous system. It crosses the blood-brain barrier on a transporter called the large neutral amino acid transporter. As it enters the brain, it enters cells, and in those cells it is converted into a substance called serotonin. Now, serotonin is a precursor molecule of another molecule called melatonin, and melatonin is the hormone that induces sleep in people. That is the reason that carbohydrate foods can make you tired. In effect, they increase brain levels of melatonin. Melatonin is a sleep-inducing hormone, and therefore carbohydrate foods can induce sleep. Now, a different group of foods that have the opposite effect to carbohydrates are proteins. Proteins tend not to cause increases in blood levels of L-tryptophan. What they do instead is they increase blood levels of a different amino acid called L-tyrosine. Now, different proteins contain different amounts of L-tyrosine. Turkey is for example, very high in L-tyrosine, and therefore will elevate L-tyrosine levels more than other proteins. But generally, proteins have this effect of raising levels in the blood of L-tyrosine. The L-tyrosine, like the L-tryptophan, will pass on the large neutral amino acid transporter into the brain. Within the brain, the cells will take up the L-tyrosine, and the L-tyrosine will be converted into a number of different substances, including adrenaline, noradrenaline, and dopamine. And these substances are called excitatory neurotransmitters. They have the opposite effect of serotonin. They are there to provide motivation to you. They are there to provide wakefulness and alertness. So therefore, protein foods, when we eat them, tend to have the opposite effect to carbohydrate foods. Therefore, one solution to being able to control your mood is the control of the amount of protein and the amount of carbohydrates you have at a particular meal. If you want to feel lethargic and you want to be sleepy, you want to reduce your anxiety levels, and you want to relax, having a high carbohydrate meal is a good idea. If you want to go to the gym and you want to be motivated, or you're going to work and you need to be very mentally active, having a high carbohydrate meal is possibly not a good idea. What you would do in that situation is have a higher protein meal. So controlling the protein and carbohydrate content of your diet, of your meals, you can actually control your state of mood. And this is something that is very useful in day-to-day life. Having a high protein breakfast, for example, will increase the levels of the excitatory neurotransmitters in your brain and will provide you with motivation for the early part of the day. Increasing the carbohydrates as you go throughout the day will gradually cause you to feel more and more sleepy, and then obviously as you get home and you're preparing to go to bed, your anxiety levels will drop, you will feel sleepy, and you will induce yourself into a nice night's sleep. Now, with all nutrition, there is an extra level of complexity on this, which is worth discussing. because it's not just the carbohydrate that you eat and how much of it you eat, it's also the type of carbohydrate you eat. To be able to understand how the type of carbohydrate you eat can influence your mood, it is worth delving into the biochemistry of how carbohydrates increase the blood levels of L-tryptophan, because carbohydrates themselves do not contain any L-tryptophan. They indirectly increase the levels of L-tryptophan in the blood, and this is unlike protein, because protein actually contains the L-tyrosine. It's the tyrosine that comes directly from the protein. There is no tryptophan in carbohydrates. That's an indirect increase in the plasma levels. So how do carbohydrate foods increase plasma levels of L-tryptophan? Now, carbohydrates can control your plasma levels of L-tryptophan because they can control your plasma levels of insulin. Insulin is a hormone that is required for passing glucose into your cells. When you eat carbohydrate, the starch that you eat, is digested into individual glucose units. Those units are absorbed across the enterocytes into the blood, and once in the blood, your blood glucose levels rise. Now, in order to be able to lower your blood glucose and push that glucose into the cells, which is where it's needed to produce energy, the hormone called insulin is needed. Think of it as the key that is the fits into the lock that allows glucose to pass through the door. Without insulin, glucose would remain in the blood, and this is what diabetes is. Now, as well as pushing glucose into the cells, insulin has effects on amino acids as well. Amino acids, contrary to popular belief, many of them also stimulate the release of insulin, and lots of them require insulin to get into the cells. When your insulin levels rise because you have eaten carbohydrate foods, not only is glucose pushed into the cells, but also a group of amino acids called the branched chain amino acids are also pushed into the cells, particularly your skeletal muscle cells. Skeletal muscle cells are very concentrated in branched chain amino acids. As your insulin levels rise, the branched chain amino acids along with glucose are pushed into your skeletal muscles. Now, branched chain amino acids are one of the group of amino acids that competes for competition across the large neutral amino acid transporter on the blood-brain barrier. Now, if you remember, I said that the way that L-tryptophan and the way that L-tyrosine gets into the brain is through the large neutral amino acid transporter. If we remove some of the inhibition from that transporter by taking the branched chain amino acids that are normally transported across it and we push them into the skeletal muscle, there is no competition for the L-tryptophan that is in your plasma. That means that more of the L-tryptophan in your plasma, in your blood, can now pass into your brain. The competition has effectively disappeared. More of the L-tryptophan gets into your brain, and therefore more serotonin and more melatonin are produced. Now, what this means is that those carbohydrates that induce the release of more insulin tend to raise plasma levels of L-tryptophan higher, and therefore they produce more serotonin and more melatonin. So if we want to manipulate our mood, and we want to create more serotonin in the brain and more melatonin, and we want to induce relaxation, and we want to induce sleepiness, we need to cause a release of insulin. And we have two choices if we want to cause a large spike, a large release of insulin. We can eat a large amount of carbohydrates, which I wouldn't recommend in one sitting because it will probably make you fat if you do it regularly. Or we can pick carbohydrates that are perhaps a little bit lower in fibre and a little bit more refined, and therefore they might cause a larger spike in the release of insulin. Now, the types of carbohydrate that might do this, let's pick an example. Honey, for example. Honey is it's a very healthy food. Honey contains many nutrients, minerals, vitamins, and other substances haven't even been identified yet, but we know they have health effects. But honey has no fibre. It's one of the only foods in nature found naturally that's very high in sugar and has very little fibre in it. It's protected by bees, which is why humans traditionally probably haven't eaten that much of it. But it is a great food for causing a release of insulin. So if we did want to, for example, induce sleepiness and we wanted to increase our brain levels of serotonin, having a piece of bread with some honey on it would be an excellent choice. Hopefully it would be a whole grain granary bread, but that in itself would cause an increase in plasma levels of L-tryptophan, and that would increase brain levels of serotonin and melatonin and induce sleepiness. And if we wanted to have the opposite effect, and we wanted to increase motivation, we wanted to increase alertness and wakefulness, we would want to limit the amount of carbohydrates we had, and particularly we would want to limit any of the more refined low fiber carbohydrates. So things like honey, things like any type of sugary drink, which you shouldn't be drinking as part of a high quality diet anyway. But those kinds of foods are no-no foods if you want to feel motivated and alert. Instead, what you want to eat is a high protein meal. You want to eat foods that are low in carbohydrate and high in protein, and you want to base your meal around protein. If you have carbohydrates with the protein, have them as vegetables. They're very, very slow release carbohydrates, and they contain very small amounts of carbohydrate. So the end result of that type of meal, let's say you had turkey with vegetables, the end result of that type of meal would be an increase in plasma levels of L-tyrosine, and you would not get this increase in the plasma levels of L-tryptophan, which would increase brain levels of serotonin and melatonin. And as a result, that type of meal would make you feel awake, alert, and motivated. So my recommendation from all of this is to time your foods so that you can control your moods. If you are early in the day and you have a full day's work ahead of you, being sleepy is not really the best thing. What you want to be is motivated. So how do we do this? Well, we turn to the higher protein foods. We try and limit not only the amount of carbohydrates, but limit those simple carbohydrates that may cause a large spike in insulin. As we pass through the day, however, and we get to the evening, what we want to do is we want to start to induce a state of sleep. We want to perhaps decrease anxiety levels because we've been stressed throughout the day. We want to become calm and relaxed, and we want to get ready for bed. That's the time when you can start to eat a little bit more carbohydrate, and perhaps before you go to bed, an hour or so before you go to bed, having a piece of toast with some honey on it, or some other simple carbohydrates, or even just the toast on its own would probably do. That will help you get a good night's sleep, because it will increase brain levels of melatonin. By timing our foods like this, by eating higher carbohydrate foods later in the day, higher protein foods earlier in the day, science has shown you can influence your mood. This really does work. These foods really do have a big influence on your motivation and behavior. And therefore, I would recommend perhaps reading a little bit more about this, trying to find some foods that are high in tyrosine, perhaps even looking at supplemental tyrosine if you want to give this a go, because supplements of tyrosine have been shown to have the same effect, obviously more so than protein foods themselves. It's a very big subject. I will perhaps cover some of this again, because there are lots of supplements you can take to influence your mood and your motivation. But they tend to work on these two pathways. They tend to work either by increasing adrenaline, noradrenaline, and dopamine, the excitatory neurotransmitters, or they tend to increase serotonin and melatonin, the inhibitory neurotransmitters. But my recommendation then would be to go for higher protein, lower carbohydrate foods earlier in the day. And when you need to induce sleep late at night and you want to feel relaxed, switch to higher carbohydrate foods and keep the protein intake limited.